China today, particularly because President Xi is having his first trip out of the country to Uzbekistan to meet with President Putin of Russia, as President Putin admits that he has some explaining to do about what's going on in Ukraine. We welcome now somebody who's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. He's Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. He's a member of the Foreign Relations as well as Finance and Homeland Security Committees. So, Senator, thanks so much for being with us. Let's start, if we could, with China and what's going on with Xi and Putin. What do you make of this meeting, and how does it affect U.S. interests?
Well, the meeting doesn't surprise me. They've been meeting somewhat regularly, and they have exercises together, which were planned, by the way, before Ukraine, apparently. But this attack on Ukraine is not going well. I was in Kyiv, as you know, the capital of Ukraine, a couple of weeks ago with one of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle. We went on a bipartisan congressional delegation to get more information and to let the Ukrainians know how strongly we support what they are doing, which is really providing a shield of freedom for the rest of the world. But in the last 3 weeks, we believe that the Ukrainians have liberated approximately 3,000 square miles and really routed the Russian troops that are there. They did it, because they have the morale and they have the resilience and the strength, thanks to the U.S. and other countries providing them better equipment. And I think it's a very bad news story for Vladimir Putin, and it's a great news story for freedom-loving people all over the world.
And when it comes to President Xi, for example, to make it somewhat less likely he's likely to expand his support for Russia right now. And on the flip side, does it really mean that we may redouble our efforts?
Well, it means that we cannot stop. It means that this is not the time to pull back, and they do need more ammunition for some of the weapons they've already been provided. We also have to recall that there are 49 other countries providing military help to Ukraine. It's not just us. We are taking the lead, and America, by showing leadership, I think has encouraged others to be involved. With regard to China, I agree with you. I think that it's very difficult to imagine that China would want to be associated with Russia right now, not just because they are not winning on the battlefield, but because they've become international pariahs. If you look at what's happening in the United Nations, you look at what's happening to non-aligned countries all around the world, including the Swiss, Sweden, Finland, and other countries who are helping Ukraine in various ways. I mean, this is extraordinary. In fact, with regard to the Swedes and the Finns, of course, are now joining NATO, which is exactly the opposite of what Vladimir Putin hoped would happen. So if I were China, I would think this is not an association you would want to have.
So when it comes to China, you had an interesting exchange, actually, yesterday that we caught with the CFO, I believe it was, of TikTok about the use of data, because one of the issues has been the security of data that is gathered from the United States, whether it would go back to China. This is a part of the exchange that you had.
I just asked you to make that cutting off all data and metadata flows to China, Chinese-based TikTok employees, ByteDance employees, or any other party located in China.
What I can commit to is that our final agreement with the U.S. government will satisfy all national security concerns, yes.
But you won't make a commitment to agree to what I have now twice asked you about?
Sorry, given the confidentiality of CFIUS, I'm not able to talk specifically about that agreement.
I'm not talking about CFIUS. I'm asking whether you'd make that commitment today.
Senator, your experience, I suspect that's not the first time you haven't really got an answer to your question, but I'm not sure she answered the question. What is the proper answer? Is there a way for the United States government to make sure that U.S. gathered data does not go back to the Chinese government?
Well, in my experience, and we've been looking into these issues for years now, David, as you know, and I've done extensive investigations on a bipartisan basis through the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations here in the Congress, and we've actually passed legislation to try to protect our own information here in the United States. But it is our sense that because companies like TikTok continue to have a presence in China, continue to provide access to Chinese nationals for information, including with regard to TikTok, as you know, information about our kids, since about half of their members are people who are under the age of 16. So, I mean, this is an amazing, I think, situation where they won't agree to simply cut off the data to China. Why are they providing this data? Why is that necessary? And other companies have been able to do it. I would hope that all of our platforms would be cognizant of the real risks involved.
So, Senator, one of the things that you're directly involved in as a sponsor, as I understand it, is, I believe it's called the Marriage Equality Act, that would ensure that same-sex marriage would be respected throughout the United States. At the same time, you need 10 Republican votes in the Senate to get that through. Do you have the votes?
We are working on it, and we'll see what happens. If the votes do not materialize here in the next few days, then I suspect this issue will be put off until after the election. But my hope is we'll have the votes. What we're doing is two things. One, simply codifying what the Supreme Court has already done. But second, it actually adds additional religious liberty protections that are not currently in law. So this is actually a victory for those who are concerned about religious liberty, as I am, and as many are. But it also does affirm that the court has made a decision and simply, again, codifies the fact that one state would have to respect another state's valid marriage. The Obergefell decision, which is the Supreme Court precedent, goes even further than that and mandates the states to allow for gay marriage. That is not part of our legislation. So the legislation, one, is actually less than the Supreme Court and therefore current law decision. And second, it adds additional religious liberty protections. So my hope is that we will be able to get this passed in the Senate and be able as a country not just to rely on the courts to decide these issues, which are tough issues, but to actually have the elected representatives, in this case the U.S. Congress, weigh in.
Senator, you have such a long list of responsibilities there, but another one is actually Homeland Security. And I see that the White House is requesting that, I guess as part of the continuing resolution, next spending package, that it include a path to citizenship for Afghan refugees. I think you have some concerns about that.
Well, we never properly vetted the Afghan evacuees who came to the United States, and this has now been something that the Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security has weighed in on and said that you know, it was inadequate what was done in terms of screening people, vetting people. So it's too bad because you remember we had this hectic withdrawal from Afghanistan and loaded a lot of people on airplanes and took them to so-called lily pads and then to the United States. Some of those people were translators and others who had helped the United States government. My view is those individuals ought to be on a pathway to citizenship. They stood by our troops and in many cases risked their lives for us. But there are many others who were not connected in that way and in no apparent way. And those people were not properly vetted. That makes no sense from a national security point of view. The FBI has told us they think there are a few dozen people, maybe more, who could pose a national security threat, who are part of that group. So let's do the vetting. Let's be sure that these people are properly screened to be sure that they're not providing a national security threat to us. And then, going forward, let's look at what the status ought to be.
And finally, Senator, this may be in some ways the biggest question for a lot of Americans today, and that is inflation. We got some really alarming numbers out. In addition to all your experience in the Senate, you, of course, ran the Office of Management and Budget, so you know a lot about the economy. Is there anything that you all up on Capitol Hill can do either to increase supply or reduce demand?
Well, you put your finger on it, David. Our issue is that here in the Congress and in the administration, two things have happened. One is tremendous new spending, unprecedented amount of spending for so-called stimulus. And that stimulus spending, which really came out of the $1.9 trillion bill that was passed a year ago, March, caused a lot of the increased demand that caused this inflation we're seeing. But also, along with that, of course, we had constricted supply already because of COVID. And that was exacerbated by other decisions the administration made on regulations, particularly with regard to energy, which is in pretty much every product, some component of energy. So to say we're going to stifle fossil fuels and to discourage the development of fossil fuels reduced the supply side as well. So obviously what we need to do is stop the stimulus spending, stop the spending that we just did again, frankly, just a few weeks ago here in Congress through the very poorly named Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually going to increase inflation short term based on the economic analysis. But second, we need to open up these supply chains, including the energy supply chains. And by doing so, through regulatory relief, through smart policies, we will be able to get this under control. But it's not happened yet. The 8.3% that we saw earlier this week from last month is very concerning. And then when you look at it since the Biden administration came into office, it's 13.2%. The way I look at it is if you had $1 in your pocket in January of 2021, it's now worth 88 cents. And that's how people are feeling. They feel like they've been shortchanged. They feel like their retirement plans are being hurt. Again, the market's down today. So we've got to turn this around, and it's by doing pro-growth policies, regulatory relief, smart tax reforms, doing things that actually encourage more supply and less stimulus.
Okay, this is very helpful on so many fronts. Thank you so much. That is Senator Rob Portman, Republican of Ohio. Coming up.